Welcome back, everyone. I hope you are all well rested after the short break. And welcome back to Room A, where we are focusing on effective altruism and animal advocacy careers. Just a short reminder about our house rules. Please keep your mic muted, your camera on, so we can see you, and post your questions to Slido so we can read them in the Q&A section afterwards. You can post the questions during the talk, and you can also vote for the questions you are most interested in. So let's begin. Let me introduce Jamie Harris. Jamie Harris is a co-founder and researcher at Animal Advocacy Careers, a new nonprofit helping advocates to maximize their positive impact for animals. He is also a researcher at Sentience Institute, a think tank researching the most effective strategies for expanding humanity's moral circle, with a focus on farmed animals. Jamie will propose a question today. Which do we need more, money or expertise? So please welcome Jamie, and Jamie, the floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Martin. Let me share my screen. Okay, great. Is that working? Can everybody see that? Okay, I'll take the thumbs up as a yes. Thanks. Okay, yeah, great. Thank you very much for the introduction, Martin. That's covered it. Don't have anything more to say, so I'll just with summarizing the goals of this session then. So as Martin said, the question I'm asking is, which do we need more, money or expertise? Help you think about how you can best contribute as an individual to the animal advocacy movement. Think where are the greatest needs, where you might be able to fit into that. Another goal is to provide some wider context for any discussions that might come up within the organization that you work in, or any organizations that you're involved in. And towards the end, I'll also suggest some possible solutions. And part of the goal of that is to elicit feedback from you guys about animal advocacy careers plans, because as Martin said, we're a relatively new organization. So I'd love to get your thoughts on what we could be doing to best address these problems and what would be most helpful, I guess. So yeah, okay. Right, so the session itself, well, this is how I'm going to cover it. I'm going to start with an overview of this question, money versus expertise, and what I mean by that. I'm going to move on to the question of whether funding, money particularly, is a bottleneck and whether that varies by country. Then I'm going to look at the expertise side of things and whether that varies by particular types of expertise. Then I'll suggest some possible solutions. Okay, so starting with this overview of what I mean by the topic. So firstly, just a quick definition. Oh, my nice picture is covered by my ugly face. Okay, so yeah, starting with this question of what a bottleneck is, and just to define the terms I'm going to be using, I guess. So I'm using the term bottleneck to mean a problem that limits the efficiency and total effects of the movement. If you think of a bottle, if you pour it out the end, it pours more slowly than it would if it was just a sort of flat, open-ended, like a glass or something like that. So it's the word, when I say bottleneck, it's similar to the word constraint or restriction. This is essentially, it sounds quite abstract, but essentially this is something that has real impact for animals in the sense of it reduces the effectiveness of the movement for helping animals. So important to address if we can. So yeah, the bottlenecks I'm going to be talking about a bit in this session are money and expertise. Oh, and just to define those, I guess, what I mean by, well, you can guess what I mean by money. I mean funding. I'm thinking mostly about non-profits rather than the for-profit space, although arguably that's part of the animal advocacy movement. And when I talk about expertise, I'm talking about the available applicants for roles, also volunteers and advisors and that sort of thing, not just full-time staff. I guess the point that I want to just address quickly now is the idea that from a non-profit's perspective, often quality matters more than quantity, in the sense that most roles will have multiple applicants. So they don't necessarily just need more people applying. They need the sort of average best, they need the best candidate to be as good as possible. So I'm talking about that idea of expertise, so skills, talents, knowledge, and so on. That matters more than just having more applicants, at least for full-time roles. Okay, so yeah, so I'm going to start off with a poll on this question. I'd like to see what your initial response is to the question of which is more of a bottleneck for your organization if you work with one. If you don't work with an organization, think about any organization that you volunteer with or donate to, or just that you feel relatively familiar with. So Martin, can we sort out the first poll? Where do people have to click? They just click on the top right?
No,
Where
I will deal with that
Great,
because
thank you.
I will have to clean the mess afterwards if I fail. So let's do this. In a few moments, you should see a pop-up window where there will be options you have to check. If you are logging in through the browser and not through the Zoom app, you might not see this window. So this is the limit of different kinds of connection. So now you should see it.
Great. So we'll give.
Oh, okay. Votes are pouring in.
Please try to not be influenced by other people's answers. I didn't know that was going to happen.
Jamie, do you see the in real time answers that I see?
I'm seeing the real time answers. I guess I don't know if other people can see that or not.
Do you people see that?
No, we're getting some shaking heads. Good. That's good news. Okay, no bias involved then. Nice. Okay, I'll give you about 5-10 more seconds.
Okay, 13 more people.
Oh, again, this is a good response rate. I appreciate this engagement. Thank you, everybody. Okay, I'll summarize the results if we've got them now. This may play with my maths if people keep adding in more results, but this is interesting. We've actually leaned slightly towards expertise being more of a bottleneck. Only one person has put they are similarly bad bottlenecks, so nobody's sitting on the fence.
Jamie, if you want, I can stop it and I'm going to show the results to all of the people. Then
oh, great. Yeah, go for that. Yeah, thank you.
Okay. So just a moment. And now you should be seeing these. Do you see the results? Okay, great.
Yeah, so I can certainly see the results. Hope everyone else can. Great. I had to take a photo of that. That was some sly research I was doing. Thank you very much. Yeah, so that's interesting. We've leaned towards expertise being slightly more of a bottleneck. And yeah, well, I guess we'll talk about this problem a bit more and see if people's minds may or may not change. I'm not trying to change your mind so much because you guys are more of an expert on your own organization than I am. Just talking about relevant concepts, I suppose. Okay, great. Thanks very much for that, Martin. Do we have to close that, or
I have to stop sharing? So now it should be gone.
Great. I think you can just minimize it if it hasn't disappeared. Perfect. Cool. Thanks. Okay. Oh yeah, I've got another. Oh yeah. So the context is we will. I'm intending to survey animal advocacy organizations a bit more sort of systematically later in the year to get at some of the specifics and some of the things that I think are relevant to this question in the rest of the talk. Okay. Going to move on to Martin, can we get the second poll straight up as well? And that is for this question. So let me explain before you fill it in, I guess. This is for the question, how much money is spent on farmed animal advocacy per year internationally? This is just your best guess. I'm interested to see how it compares to the estimate I'm going to share in a second. I'm trying to exclude animal-free food products and companies here. So this is essentially non-profit funding in the world. Where do you think it would fall? Okay, I'll give you about 5-10 seconds left. Okay, great. Martin, can we end the polling? Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take a little photo. Nice. Okay, interesting. So the most there was 10 to 100 million. Well, let me share with you another estimate, I guess. Yeah, let's close down that. So minimize it if you have to or whatever. And it's back. Oh, okay. So this is the estimate of philanthropy projects. They estimated 150 to 180 million per year. And I'm going to get the phrase wrong, the most commonly guessed answer there. So that's interesting, maybe a slight positive update for people. I don't actually know the methodology that Open Philanthropy used, so I can't attest very strongly to its accuracy, other than that I'm inclined to put quite a lot of stock in it, because Open Philanthropy themselves granted out nearly $40 million in 2019, and their research tends to be quite high quality. So I put some weight on that. I guess so. Maybe a positive update for some people, but maybe it's not. It's still obviously far less than we would have in an ideal world. Just to compare it to some other amounts of money to get a sense of how it compares. So investments in plant-based food companies in the US, this is an estimate provided by the Good Food Institute, 650 million in 2018. That's just the US, so obviously it's much more internationally. Companion animal shelters in the US alone, I forgot to change the sign around. That should say over $1 billion per year, from some data that animal charity evaluators shared from, I think it was collected from GuideStar. And international aid is far more than that. That's just the US government alone. And then if you compare it to other social movements, I don't have good data on this, but my impression from having read about some others in my research at Centers Institute, the anti-abortion movement has probably a similar amount, maybe slightly more in the US. The anti-death penalty probably, almost certainly, I think, has less. And then I'd guess the environmental movement has a lot more. So it varies by movement, but it's not completely in a different category, I guess, to some of those other ones. So I'm going to just present some evidence that the movement is not constrained by funding, first of all. So animal charity evaluators have 4 top charities, and these animal charity evaluators obviously evaluate charities, animal charities, and those charities have received an average of $7.5 million each since 2016 from Open Philanthropy, the organization I just mentioned. That covered an average of about 50% of each of those organizations' expenditure, as far as I could work out from the publicly available information. And that compares to a much lower average of 2.2 million per farmed animal advocacy grantee of Open Philanthropy. So essentially, if you share their estimations of animal charity evaluators and Open Philanthropy of what some of the most cost-effective organizations are, that suggests that these organizations do get quite a lot of funding. Another reason you might think that the movement has enough funding, if you think that the gap between organizations that get money is quite a lot, so some of the organizations that get, say, the gap between the best organizations and the least cost-effective organizations is large, you might take that as evidence that there are few promising funding opportunities. And to get a sense of this, I mean, I'm not saying that's my position, but if you wanted to think about this, you could look at ACEs grantees, you could look at effective altruism funds grantees, maybe even some of the recipients of Open Philanthropy themselves. I've definitely heard some people suggest that some of these grantees don't seem to be particularly high quality, but yeah, I'll leave that to your judgment, I guess. There was also a survey of effective altruism organizations, so organizations focused on various different causes, trying to use reason and evidence to do the most good they can. And that found that on average, organizations rated themselves as more talent constrained, so expertise was more of a problem than funding constrained. The average was 3.8 out of 5 compared to 2.4 out of 5. But animal charity evaluators and the Good Food Institute were the only organizations there that focused primarily on animal issues, which was only 3 out of 29 respondents. So essentially, it's not an animal survey, it's a wider thing. And some of the other organizations in that survey work on issues that do have, that tend to be seen as less funding constrained than animal advocacy. Great, okay, so that was some evidence that the movement is not constrained by funding. Now I'm going to give you some evidence in the opposite direction. So I mentioned animal charity evaluators' top charities. The very existence of that status is kind of evidence that there's, I mean, at least if you trust animal charity evaluators' judgment, that there are funding gaps, because they can only be assigned that status if ACE concludes that those organizations have considerable room for more funding. And they've always had 3 or 4 top charities and numerous additional standout charities at any one time. So this suggests that, in contrast to what I was saying before, at least if you agree with their judgment, then some of the most cost-effective organizations still need substantially more money, basically. Yeah, so Animal Advocacy Careers, the organization that I work for, has conducted a short survey, which was with 12 CEOs and hiring professionals from 9 of Animal Charity Evaluators' top or standout charities, or former standout charities. And we asked them what bottleneck do you identify most with in your organization, and funding, if you can't see it there, was 9 people selected that, by far the most commonly selected response, although as you can see those numbers add up to more than 12, so sorry, more than 11, so people were able to select more than one response, but funding was the most common one. So as I say, I don't want you to put, I guess don't put too much stock in that. We're going to do some more thorough research into this later, but I'm just listing the evidence we've got. So we also have some anecdotal evidence of this. Yeah, so having worked at Sentence Institute for 2 years, I'm most familiar with research organizations, but I certainly have that impression from a limited number of conversations that these organizations get lots of talented applicants and funding is more of a constraint. Yeah, so you could also just disagree with the funding decisions of animal charity evaluators and open philanthropy and think that certain organizations need more funding than they're getting and certain organizations are being excluded, and there's a gap for the funding for those organizations. As I mentioned, open philanthropy gave out around $40 million in 2019, and animal charity evaluators do redirect some funding to the organizations they recommend through their recommendation process. And there's various grant-making organizations. You could disagree with their views as well, I guess. So that was some evidence for and against. I want to just kind of make an almost theoretical point now, which is just that money is flexible, and money can be used to help animals almost however much money you have, which is essentially another reason to expect that money is going to be more of a bottleneck in the long term than talent would. Which it might not necessarily offer a lot of clarity on a personal decision that you might be facing, but so as I say, it's kind of theoretical reason. So I guess the point is that you can use money you can transfer it into expertise if you have enough of it. Basically, you can do things like paying higher salaries so you can attract talent from the corporate sector. You can try new recruitment strategies that target a slightly different audience. You can offer training programs to upskill your current staff. You can outsource services to for-profit companies and so on. So there are ways that you can address talent gaps if you have enough money, basically. That does mean that the money you spend on these things might not be as useful, as cost-effective as the last lot of money you had. So in other words, like the next $100 million that the movement receives might not be as useful as the last $100 million, but it still helps a lot. Okay, cool. So third and final poll for the session. What proportion of the movement's funding goes to US and Canada, would you guess? So we mentioned before that there was over $100 million spent on the farm animal movement in total. Martin, can we get the poll up, please? Yeah, great. So what proportion of the movement's total funding? So Openfill estimated about $165 million. What portion goes to the US? Okay, we've got nearly a full house, so 5 seconds, and then Martin, can you close it when you're ready? Thanks. Okay, great. Nice. So we've estimated 60 to 70% was the most commonly selected one. So let's close that down and we'll compare it to information I've got. Okay, so, oops, sorry, just lost my notes. Okay, great. So Openfill's estimates suggest that around 55% of the movement's funding goes to US or Canada. So again, maybe a slight positive update for people that that money is more evenly distributed than some people were guessing. You can see, some of their estimates for where it's distributed there. Oceania, so Australia, New Zealand gets 5 million down in the bottom there. Okay, great. And moving on. Oh no, the last column is covered. Okay. So before we get too disgruntled out here in Europe that it's too uneven, when we compare the so you can see here I've done a little table where I've compared the funding estimate from Open Philanthropy to UN data on the number of farmed. Oh no, actually, sorry. This is also Open Phil's estimate of the number of land farmed animals in these various areas of the world. And if you work it out, then basically in both Europe and North America, the amount of funding per 1,000 land farmed animals is well over 10 times the amount in some other parts of the world, basically. So one conclusion from this, it seems to suggest that if funding is a bottleneck in the US or Europe, it probably also is outside of those areas too, if not more so. That's the initial takeaway, I guess. There are some caveats to that. So the cost of living and probably also the cost of advocacy will vary. So the differences might not be quite as bad as they seem. And we also have to bear in mind that this doesn't show that funding is the most important bottleneck. It just shows that it probably is a bottleneck. So other bottlenecks might also be worse in some of these other areas. And you could say that you could guess that expertise is also more of a bottleneck, for example. Okay, so if I move on to basically, this is from where I wrote a profile which was on the topic of growing the animal advocacy community in countries where it is small or new. And I asked people a question, and this has also got a couple of interviews from the Sentence Institute podcast, which I run, where I asked people, for a talented young person in a wealthy Western country who is equally excited and likely to be successful at doing an intensive course in your country's language. And sorry, we're getting some noise. So if people could make sure they're muted, that'd be great. Thank you. So if a Western person equally successful and likely to be successful at doing an intensive course in your country's language and going to work there directly, or in just seeking to maximize their income in their own country and donate as much of it as they could to your organization, which would you recommend? And this was essentially a convoluted way of asking if people were more excited about receiving more money or receiving more help. So it kind of gets at that funding versus expertise trade-off. And essentially the answers were much more mixed than I expected them to be, especially given that people had said that funding was a substantial bottleneck for them. So no real answer emerged. My summary was essentially pretty much exactly evenly balanced. So basically, in South America, in various countries, both expertise and funding are a bottleneck. So I'm going to move on to some evidence that that expertise is also a bottleneck. Obviously, this trade-off that I've been talking about is a bit simplistic. You can have both at the same time, or you can have neither very much. So they could both be bottlenecks, basically, as with what I was just saying with some of those countries there that both seem to be a bottleneck. So you can have lots of different types of bottleneck. You can have funding bottlenecks, a lack of awareness and support for your work, a lack of political power, organizational cultural issues, language barriers, coordination with external organization problems, logistics and operations, lack of good quality research, or just willingness to work for nonprofits, which could be about the awareness of those opportunities or issues to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion. And all these different things could be probably partially solved through funding or through an increase in expertise. So so there are lots of, you can ignore the numbers on this just to look at the left-hand side. There are lots of different types. So these are the categories I used in some research I conducted for my advocacy careers: campaigns, corporate engagement or volunteer management, management and leadership, operations, administration and human resources, marketing or communications, fundraising, web development and other technical skills, research, government policy, lobbying or legal, natural sciences, and just a category for other. So I'm going to go through briefly some evidence that some specific types of expertise, well, I guess we have initial evidence that some of these specific types of expertise are constrained, and they are a constraint in the movement. So yeah, fundraising, that survey I mentioned earlier with the 12 CEOs and hiring professionals from Animal Charity Generators recommended charities. 5 respondents to the survey selected fundraising expertise as one of the 6 skills that their organization most needed, which was the second most frequently selected option. There was also some other evidence of that in the survey. The spot check that I was just talking about, the research I did for animal advocacy careers, this one's a little bit more complicated and it's quite weak evidence, but the idea is that if certain types of expertise are undersupplied in the community, so there's not enough of it relative to the needs of the community, we would expect that those skill sets we'd see them more frequently in job adverts relative to the number of people in those roles currently, because essentially those roles would be harder to fill. So there's a lot of limitations to this. Don't take it too literally, I guess. But the blue ones are essentially where it seems like there's a bit of a gap. So you can see operations 28% in the advertised jobs compared to 18% of current roles were that, suggesting they were struggling to hire for those roles. Fundraising also there, which was the one I was talking about, and campaigns was one of the only areas where there was a notable difference in the opposite direction. So, as I say, we've got that evidence from Animal Advocacy Careers Survey. We've got some evidence from that spot check research that I just mentioned. There's also a bunch of external reports suggesting that nonprofits generally struggle to hire and maintain fundraisers. So a 2013 report found that senior fundraisers are especially hard to hire. 2012 report also suggested that turnover rates are really high, with fundraisers staying on average only for 16 months in their job. So given that happens, animal advocacy organizations we'd expect them to face similar difficulties unless there's some particular reason why they're not facing it. So yeah, we've got some different sources of evidence there that fundraising is a bit of a bottleneck, but as I say, fundraising expertise rather than just funding, because obviously they're related but not exactly the same. Yeah, but as I say, we're hoping to do some more sort of systematic research into these things later. So don't walk away being like, this is definitely a really strong problem. There's just some evidence there. Okay, management leadership was another area. So in our survey that I mentioned before, 7 out of 12 respondents selected management as one of up to 6 skills their organizations most needed, which was was actually the highest above fundraising. And again, there was some other evidence and some of the other questions, that suggested that. I also mentioned earlier that Centre for Effective Altruism survey of essentially mostly non-animal advocacy organizations. And again, their management was also rated as the most needed skill or ability. This problem has also been emphasized to us a few times anecdotally in various events and conversations we've had. So some evidence there, again, that management leadership is a bottleneck. So another issue that we've looked at is what I mentioned before. I showed you those tables before, where I talked about the idea of growing the animal advocacy community in countries where it is small or new. And remember that both a lack of funding, remember I mentioned before that a lack of funding seems to be a major constraint in organizations, but they're also in these countries, but they're also constrained by a lack of dedicated and talented advocates in general. Maybe more of a numbers thing, despite what I said at the start about quality versus quantity. Don't look at the numbers too closely. I'll explain this. To get a sense of the size of the animal advocacy communities in various countries, we also asked our interviewees in this skills profile I mentioned before to estimate the number of people who were substantially engaged with farmed animal advocacy in their country. We gave some quite imprecise definitions of what we meant by substantially engaged farmed animal advocates. So the estimates will probably vary quite a lot by what people took us to mean. Perhaps translation, language type concerns as well. And also most of our interviewees noted that they were very uncertain, and these are just ballpark guesses, so please do not take them literally. But if you compare them to essentially the estimates we came up with for the UK and the US, which are again very rough, we're not very confident in them at all, and you compare it to the number of the information that we have from the UN about the consumption and production of animal products in these countries, you can basically calculate a very rough estimate of consumption or production in a country. And of the people we spoke to, 8 out of 13 cases, our interviewees' estimates actually imply a number that is smaller than 1/10 of our own estimates for the United States. So essentially, animal advocacy, in terms of like having expertise there, as well as what we mentioned before about there being a lack of funding in these places, here's some more evidence that it's basically 10 times as neglected or more in some of these countries than it is in the United States. So I guess the takeaway for me from that was that even if you think some countries might be like lower priority from an objective movement-wide perspective or something, they're so neglected that we just need more people working on this in those countries. Yeah. So last area I'm going to mention is politics, policy, and lobbying. So I've been mostly talking about advocacy and nonprofit type roles so far, but this is certainly not the only type of way you can have a positive impact for animals over the course of your career. Yeah, so that survey I mentioned before, 5 out of 12 respondents selected government as the biggest talent gap in the animal movement. We also collected a similar survey, including some people from CARE last year, had about 29 respondents, again, very rough and ready. And this had a similar question. And again, government was was the most commonly selected option as a bottleneck. The survey from Centre for Effective Altruism I mentioned before, again, there, government and policy experts was rated as the most needed skill or ability for the movement, even if not for particular organizations that responded. So this is a bit of a weird thing because there's also evidence suggesting that politics, policy, and lobbying expertise is not needed extensively in paid roles in animal advocacy nonprofits. My guess is that there are less, based on some things I've seen and collected, as there's probably less than 100 roles in the world in animal advocacy nonprofits focusing on lobbying, although this could increase slightly in the future, potentially. But yeah, I guess more importantly than that is that we'd only expect, out of those 3 words at the top, politics, policy, and lobbying, as in like pressuring governments, we only expect those lobbying roles to be at nonprofits. The rest would be in bureaucracies and public institutions in countries' governments themselves. So yeah, and I guess our impression is that there are quite few people, sorry, there are few people working in those sorts of roles with a targeted focus on supporting the animal advocacy movement, even though there are thousands of such possible roles where people could have a high impact for animals. So here's just an example of some of the different types of roles there are in the US. 50 governors, you can see members of Congress, that's like the America's parliament type thing if you're not familiar with it, and then state, more sort of local politics, but then there's also people working in the administration. In the US Department of Agriculture, for example, there are 100,000 employees roughly, although fewer focus on farmed animals specifically, obviously quite a lot fewer. But the point is there are lots of different types of roles and they're not all in nonprofits, and some of these could have a really high impact for animals. And yet I'm not aware, at least, of many people who are really motivated to help animals who work in these sorts of roles. Cool. So that's some evidence that is also a talent bottleneck. So just to summarize the areas that I mentioned as potential areas where expertise is a constraint: fundraising, management leadership, growing the community in countries where the animal advocacy community is small or new, and then politics and policy, and also potentially lobbying. Great. So now I'm going to talk about some possible solutions to these problems. I don't want to leave you feeling, oh, there's so many constraints, we're in a tight spot. Well, we do have some problems to deal with, I guess, but I want to suggest some solutions. So this slide, I want you to not place very much weight on anything I say for the next minute or so, because this is just a very rough and ready brainstorm, I guess, to spark some ideas and discussion maybe. I haven't thought very long about any of these suggestions. So if you think, hey, I'm already doing that, please don't be offended. It's not intended as a criticism. It was just an initial set of ideas. So remember that I said earlier that investment in plant-based food companies far outweighs donations to animal advocacy nonprofits. I wonder whether there are ways to more systematically tap into that and introduce more funding into the movement. So we could do something like, there's an organization in the effective altruism movement called Founders Pledge, where essentially people, when they start a new for-profit company, a tech company, they pledge to donate a certain amount, a large proportion of the money they get out of that, basically. So we could try and do something similar specifically for animal-free food companies, or we could just, maybe there's some way of collaborating with Founders Pledge. I know, for example, Uma Valetti of Memphis Meats is already a pledger at Founders Pledge. So there could be a way to sort of more explicitly tap into that potential group and focus on raising money for farmed animal issues, because I'm sure a lot of them care about those issues. There are lots of other, what I'm going to call meta, sort of movement-wide, non-organization specific fundraising opportunities that I can imagine and that people could experiment with and try out. So one way to think of this would be whether there are particular high-earning professional audiences that we could better tap into. So again, there are models for this in the effective altruism community that are doing this to some extent. Founders Pledge I just mentioned, but there's also an organization called Effective Giving that works with a small number of really high net worth donors. It's kind of similar to what Open Philanthropy does with Carrie Schuner and Dustin Moskowitz. There's also Raising for Effective Giving, which targeted poker players who tend to be quite interested in rationality and quite amenable to effective altruism. So there are some examples there of like tapping into particular professional audiences. Another way we could try to address this is by the way we think about careers in animal advocacy and the way we talk to other people about this. So animal advocacy careers and others could, just anybody listening in their conversations with people could recommend a bit more that career paths, that people consider career paths that bring in more money. This is what has been called in effective altruism the idea of earning to give, trying to earn as much money as possible so that you can donate as much to the non-profit sector as possible. And the idea being that if you earn and donate enough, you could achieve a lot more good than you could if you worked on the issue directly yourself in some cases. Another option is working as a grant maker at foundations that have only a small interest in animal advocacy issues, to maybe nudge them to give more in this direction, or potentially just give more effectively. So I think I've got another suggestion. Yeah, so animal charities, I don't know the extent to which this already happens, but could try and nudge their volunteers a bit more towards increasing their income and donating, rather than seeking to nudge them towards greater volunteering or working directly in the movement. It's a bit of a speculative idea. I don't know, like I say, I don't know how optimistic people would be about this, but if this idea excites you and you think, yeah, we could do something like that, sort of set up some kind of systematic help and resources and encouragement, please do let me know and get in touch, because I'd be keen to explore the possibilities for that if you're interested. Okay, and one more possible suggestion is a new nonprofit or some existing nonprofits could focus a bit more on like coordinating fundraising efforts, basically. So the question is, so they could do things like do research to improve fundraising effectiveness, like systematic efforts to test how easy it is to fundraise amongst different types of audiences, or create better summaries of the empirical evidence on what makes good fundraising, including doing expert interviews and that sort of thing that hasn't necessarily always been freely available. Could do primary research. So if you don't know this already and you're interested in fundraising, the organization Fawnlytics have done some surveys and some experiments to try and work out what works best for farmed animal advocacy fundraising, but they've only done this like 4 or 5 different surveys and experiments, so maybe there could be more of that sort of thing. There's also a concern that fundraising is what's called a zero-sum game by economists, i.e. that fundraising for one organization essentially just doesn't actually raise money, it just kind of takes it from other organizations. And so there could be some effort to kind of coordinate movement-wide fundraising and work out where organizations would like gain for the movement as a whole rather than compete. But that's very speculative. I don't know how easy that is to do. Okay, so that was a bunch of suggestions. Like I say, if anybody's excited by those ideas, please do get in contact. I'd be happy to chat about them more, but they're very, off the cuff, haven't thought about them a huge amount. So I'll speak more concretely about what animal advocacy careers is doing on the kind of expertise, talent side of things. So one thing that we offer is we offer online careers advice. So we have these skills profiles that I mentioned briefly earlier, which is essentially where we have researched each of those areas I mentioned earlier that we have some evidence is a bottleneck for the movement, to create some advice so that people can think about, is this a good fit for me? How well do my skills match up to that? How do I prepare to enter this area? All that sort of thing. So we've got one of those for management and leadership. We've got one of those for fundraising. We've got one of those for growing the animal advocacy community in countries where it is small or new. And we've got one coming out soon on politics, policy, and lobbying. Another service that we have is one-to-one advice calls. So if you're there thinking, how can I best contribute to the movement? How can I address some of these expertise gaps? Especially, if you're so we can have one-to-one advice calls with you, and basically we can tailor this to whatever your needs are, what sort of stage your career you're in. If you're, you might be a student or thinking about lots of flexibility, or you might be thinking about how best to apply your existing expertise. We're happy to have a call with you. Please do check that out on our website and submit a short application, which allows us to have a more structured call with you. And also, if you can think of anybody who would benefit from this, even if it's not yourself, please do tell them. We would love to be able to speak to more people about this and share some advice with them. So please let people know. And another thing we're offering, if that sounds a bit too in-depth and overwhelming, especially if you're relatively new to animal advocacy, then you might be more interested in an online course and workshop that we're launching soon. I would guess about a month, but I guess it could be a bit longer than that before we launch it. And that is going to be integrating some of the research from the effective animal advocacy community, the kind of strategic movement-wide stuff, as well as some ideas and recommendations on careers, decision-making, how to help animals the most over the course of your career, sorry. And then it will culminate in you actually making a career plan and starting to think about some next steps. So yeah,
left, Jamie.
Yeah, that's fine. This is my last slide. And yeah, the last thing we're offering at the moment is if you're kind of in the opposite direction, if you're already working full time in the movement, we have management and leadership. We're offering some support for employees of animal advocacy organizations to develop their management and leadership skills through either an online course or to you. And please do have a look at our website and apply for them. And yeah, the reason I slotted this slide in was not just self-promotion. I guess these are my suggestions about the best ways that we think we've thought about to address some of those expertise bottlenecks that I was talking about, although we do have lots of other things we'd like to try as well. So if you have suggestions for what would work well, what you would be optimistic about us trying, please do get in touch with us and let us know what you think. That would be really helpful to us because it's quite hard to get concrete feedback on these sorts of things. So I would genuinely appreciate that. Great. Okay. Quick summary of what I've been talking about. Sorry, Martin. The movement does seem to be substantially constrained by money, I think, at least. Although interesting to see that actually there were some positive updates for people compared to the sort of average guess. Even more constrained by this outside of North America and Europe and Oceania, so in Asia and South America and potentially Africa as well, although I know less about that. But those areas are quite often also constrained by a lack of expertise. And the movement in North America and Europe also constrained by specific types of expertise. I wouldn't say like the movement is generically constrained by expertise, but specific types of expertise, there is some evidence that it's struggling with those types. I also just want to finish off by saying, yes, there are constraints, but with those solutions I was suggesting, I think there are ways that you can take targeted efforts. You know, we don't have to just keep sort of going on business as usual, fingers crossed that it works out. We can take targeted efforts to address the problems that we've identified for the movement. And I think we can make progress and increase the effectiveness of the movement and do more to help animals. So yeah, thanks very much for listening. I hope it's informed some thinking about individual career decisions and or some. Yeah, thanks very much, and I look forward to any questions we've got time for.
Thank you, Jamie. We have some 7 minutes for Q&A session. So I would like to remind you all to submit your questions through Slido. And you can also vote for the questions you would like to hear answered, because we have limited time and probably more questions than we will be able to do. We already have some first questions. First, it's from Siobhan. Hi, Jamie. If about 50% of roles involve research, but there were no advertised roles in your survey, does that mean organizations generally hire researchers internally?
So I might have misheard, but so there's about 7% of current roles that I identified involved research. I had a slightly strange method. So the number of like roles that are explicitly researcher roles is actually slightly smaller than that as well. There aren't a lot of researchers. That the advertised roles thing, it was a snapshot from any one time. So that's not like an average over the course of several years. It was just at that time because it's relatively rare. It's not that surprising. That's why I didn't circle it. Do they hire internally? No, that's not my impression. Certainly, well, I guess I don't know about like within, say, if you move to a slightly different type of role within like the Humane League. No, actually, yeah, I'm not aware of that having happened. You know, they tend to advertise these jobs.
Okay, thank you. The next question is from Stien, if I pronounce it correctly. In countries where the effective animal advocacy movement has most room to grow, do you think the expertise gaps are the same as... Oh, just a second, I lost the question. Okay, once again, sorry about that. In countries where the effective animal advocacy movement has most room to grow, do you think the expertise gaps are the same as in established countries? So also management and fundraising?
I would guess no, not the same. Especially in a country where there is less of a movement, you have less specialized roles generally. An organization is going to tend to be smaller, so it's going to be more along the lines of, I mean, management leadership to some extent, but it's more about almost like entrepreneurship and doing everything at once. That said, people were quite optimistic. That said, almost like some of the people I spoke to, they did have that sort of experience, and they kind of needed specialized support. So if you're not in one of those countries and you have specialist skills, there are ways to support these people, I think. I would definitely encourage, for example, signing up to the directory I created called the Effective Animal Advocacy Community Directory. We can find from the effective animal advocacy already on it, effective animal advocacy discussion, and put in your expertise that you have, and people can contact you if that would be helpful to them. Say that you're happy to volunteer your time for that. That could be really helpful. Sorry, that was a bit of a detour from the question, Steen. Yeah, I think the skills probably differ slightly. If you're interested in what specifically people said they needed, you can have a look at the skills profile I wrote on that, and there's a section there on what sorts of expertise are most helpful. It included things like social media management, also veterinary skills. There was just a few sort of specific skill sets that some of the interviewees fairly commonly said they needed help with. But yeah, I think in general, it's more like entrepreneurship, setting stuff up, generalist skills as well.
Okay, thank you. Another question. Paid position often attract more than 100 applicants within effective animal advocacy. Would you say this implies a lack in funding, can't hire enough of them, or expertise, too many underqualified?
Yeah, interesting. Hard to, I guess the way that I've updated slightly on hearing that sort of story is towards thinking that funding is a bottleneck, because if there was more money, they'd be able to hire more of those people. But I guess you could interpret it's not strong evidence for that. For example, if you thought, for example, that there was only like one or two strong candidates and then lots of people just applying. Where was I going to go with that? Yeah. I lost my train of thought, so apologies. That wasn't a very coherent answer, but let's ask another one.
Okay. Okay, this is another question from Andrea. I understood that we have 50% chance to get a one-to-one call on animal advocacy careers if we are unlucky. Is it still possible to have an advice call? Oh, I should have put emphasis on
So
other
you
point.
wouldn't have an advice call, at least not this. Sorry, what was the end of this question?
Yeah, I messed it up a little bit with my emphasis. So I understood that we have 50% chance to get one-on-one call on animal advocacy careers. If we are unlucky, is it still possible to have an advice call?
Yeah, so we wouldn't be able to give you a call, at least whilst we're running the program as it currently is, but we could potentially give you one later. Obviously, you'd still be able to access all of our online advice and that sort of thing. That is just how we're running the service now. It enables us to work out how useful it is, and it enables us to work out if this is something we should be doing on a larger scale. So I appreciate it may be a bit irritating not knowing whether you'd actually get that or not, and I really appreciate people's patience with that. But hopefully, if you think it's useful enough, then a 50% chance of having an advice call is worth the 10 to 20 minutes it might take you to fill in the application. And we also hope that the application process itself is like a mini planning process, and that it will be somewhat useful even if you don't end up having a advising call. So yeah, appreciate the patience, but we wouldn't be able to give you one like that. We wouldn't be able to give you a full advising call if you were unlucky.
Okay, and we have time for one last quick question from Marta Vronska. Should we maximize the number of people involved in the movement? Like there are many vegan, vegetarian people who are not actively involved in the movement.
Well, I guess it depends what you're thinking the trade-off is there. If you're saying like, should the movement devote lots of time to just like increasing engagement from random vegans, depends on the organizational model. Like, for example, I do think that there may have been slightly insufficient experimentation with different types of kind of like mass movement. Like, I'm quite excited about the group Animal Rebellion, who are quite effectiveness focused, but they're more like mobilizing lots of people for legislative campaigns. I guess VGT in Austria, who are giving a talk next, I think, do something a bit like that. But for other organizations, like I'll contrast that to say global food partners, who are an organization doing like essentially consulting, animal welfare consulting for for the animal agriculture industry, basically. And they obviously don't need just like they don't need lots and lots of people. So it depends on the needs of the organization. Do I think that some kind of like broader outreach? I don't know. Yeah, I do think there's probably some more opportunity for more sort of a clearer pipeline of like ways to get involved in the movement for people who are just like vegans or whatever. But yeah, I haven't thought very concretely about how to best do that.
Thank you, Jamie. Our time is up, so it is time to finish this talk. Thank you very much for your answers and for your presentation.